You know those late nights, maybe after a party or a hangout with some friends, where you sit around a campfire and just talk? It can be about anything, and usually is, but for years there's been one subject that always seems to come up. The challenge that we could hop on a plane, buy a car sight unseen in an unfamiliar place, and drive it home. We would talk about it in jest, sometimes sending out-of-state listings for terrible cars to each other as sort of a dare. And I can only speak for myself here, but I kinda always thought that's as far as it would go. But then, in a strange way and at a strange time, an opportunity arose. We had an excuse to fly to a different part of the United States, a friend in the area willing to help us, time in everyone's schedule, and hopefully enough money saved to pay for everything. There was no telling when or if another opportunity like this would present itself. So we decided to take a leap of faith and bought one-way tickets. Pretty much every day leading up to the trip, we spent hours looking at a parade of hundreds of local listings for cars in the area. There was only a loose idea of what sort of car I wanted, but eventually a seller in Arizona got back to me agreeing to go along with our crazy plan. Somehow, suddenly, all those nights of idle chatter and joking around the campfire had become real.
I'm almost there!
Put it back in there?
Yeah, why not?
Looks flat to me. Okay, whatever. When you weld stainless, I don't know how to do it. You drive it. It's ugly, but I'm proud of it.
What?
That works. Seriously?
I think I moved it a little bit. What's the problem?
Whoa, hold up. My solution to not having enough time to work on my existing projects was to buy a Ford Pinto and drive it 3/4 of the way across the country? Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And so, to set off on the journey, we packed our bags and hit the road. The road to the airport.
Rob has never been on a plane. How you feeling?
Rob and I had snagged one-way tickets out of Dulles Airport. Kat had kindly agreed to drive us and deftly navigated through the swarm of bumper cars. We were traveling without any checked bags because we knew space would be at a premium. Sean didn't even bring a carry-on, electing to bring just a backpack. He had flown out a few days ahead of us, so we planned to meet up after we landed. Walking through the airport was the first time in a long time that I had been in a crowd of this size, so it felt pretty strange. COVID vaccinations had become widely available in our area, so travel was starting to pick back up. Even though they had started increasing, one of the factors that allowed us to take this trip were that ticket prices were still pretty inexpensive, especially for bigger airports like the one in Las Vegas we were heading to.
Week to find day for travel. The weather here is not so nice, but the weather in Vegas, of course, is perfect. Sunny skies, 90 degrees. We expect a couple of bumps as we're leaving this area.
You like bumps, right?
No.
You love bumps.
After the typical 30-minute delay on the runway, we were finally cleared for takeoff, and the pilot really wanted to get out of there because it was a pretty steep ascent to get above the clouds. But everything went smoothly, and after just a few minutes, we were cruising with a hell of a view. It was a non-stop 5-hour flight, and I was having a good time just looking out the window, but Rob...
You feeling good?
Nope. Never flying again.
Well, at least that means he's committed to the road trip since he can't bail and just fly back. Pretty soon his torment would be over, well, this particular aspect of it, and we were greeted by the setting sun as we approached our destination. Because of the time zone difference, we left at 6 p.m. and arrived at 8. Swooping low over the desert valley, we came in for a smooth landing and finally had our wheels back on the ground.
Please use care when opening up the overhead bins, as the contents may have shifted during our flight.
And no more than 50 steps after getting off the plane, it was clear that we were in the right place.
This is like that scene in Resident Evil with the lasers.
Oh no.
We made plans to meet up with Sean, and as we left the air-conditioned sanctum of the airport, we were hit with our first experience of desert air.
That warm, dry air goes down smooth. Jeez.
From there, we took a taxi to meet up with Sean at the sketchy Airbnb, then got in another car and headed to the Strip. It really is a spectacle to see all that lit up at night. But we were all pretty tired and didn't really feel like doing anything, so we wandered over to White Castle, where we had the privilege of staying for about 2 hours before heading back to the Airbnb for the night. Quarters were a bit close between the three of us, but Rob sacrificed himself to the least comfortable fold-out ever conceived. This was the only full day in Vegas for Rob and I, so we mostly just wandered around and did some touristy stuff. Vegas is certainly a strange place. It's not necessarily my cup of tea, but for the spectacle of the whole place, I'd say it's worth visiting at least once.
We've got all these candles at Spirit Halloween.
But this wasn't primarily a sightseeing trip. But then why did we land in Vegas when the car is in Arizona? Well, and this was actually the original impetus for all of this happening, there was a bowling tournament. Some of our friends had come all the way out here to knock over some pins, and we were there to support them and hang out after. This tournament, which we weren't even competing in, was the excuse to come out here and make this whole trip happen. We checked out some of the other goings-on at the South Point before heading back downtown and meeting up with the most important enabler in this whole story. This is Travis. None of this would have worked without him. And you'll see exactly why that is in just a little bit, but for now we've got a bit more time to kill in Vegas. We spent the rest of the day wandering around as a group and exploring some of the unique architecture and decoration that the area has to offer. We even found a Firebird. We capped off the night by going to a very overpriced Vegas buffet, watching an impressive nighttime fountain display, and spending about an hour wandering around just off the Strip in a cellular dead zone before we were able to get a ride back to where we were staying to pass out. This was our last morning in Vegas, so we packed our bags, said goodbye to the Airbnb dogs, and hello to Travis's dog, Jewel, who Rob and I got to share the backseat of Travis's 2019 VW Jetta with. We stopped by the South Point one more time on the way out of town to wish our friends well on the last day of their bowling tournament, and then hit the road to Arizona. We were heading to Travis's apartment in Phoenix, where he was kind enough not only to take us, but to allow us to stay. On top of all that, he even agreed to take us on the scenic route back, which totaled around 400 miles. The sprawling mountains and wide open landscapes of this area are truly something to behold. Another thing that was continuously amazing the entire time we were out there was just how frickin' hot it was. Of course, the desert's not exactly known for its temperate climate, but the time we happened to be out there was also a pretty severe heat wave. While in Vegas, the daytime temperatures stayed pretty much between 95 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Little did we know, in just a few days that would feel like long sleeve weather. But at least for now, we were riding around in a modern car with nice, cool air conditioning. Though, just on the other side of those windows, the more we saw of the world out here, the more alien it felt to me. I've spent my entire life on the east coast of the United States. Previous to this, the farthest west I had ever been was Kentucky. So I'm used to green trees and pretty much just rolling hills as far as the eye can see, but out where we were, it was flat, and you could see for miles and miles in every direction. And the only thing stranger to me than the flatness was how quickly it became just the opposite. Emerging from the desert's surface are mountains, cliffs, huge piles of rock, and some of the roads take you right over the top. Pretty soon, we found out that the 5 of us and our luggage in the Jetta was asking a bit much of the turbo 4-cylinder when it was almost 110 degrees out. The coolant temperature gauge was reading pretty high, and when Travis switched over the dash to read engine oil temperature, it was north of 270 degrees. We slowed down a bit overall and started turning off the air conditioning when climbing hills. That seemed to do the trick, and we were still able to do at least 70 miles an hour and keep the oil temperature below 250. Still, that's running pretty warm, and it does not inspire confidence for how things are going to go with our actual road trip car. But we really just have to take this one step at a time, and luckily, pretty soon we found cooler temperatures in Flagstaff, Arizona. We stopped in a nice, quiet little area, and unsurprisingly, Juul was very popular there. We only stayed for about half an hour to stretch our legs and let the car cool down, but by the time we were leaving, the sun was low in the sky and it seemed like we had gotten through the heat of the day. The next leg of the drive took us down and down and down and down into Sedona, which had, between the green trees and the red rocks, some of the most beautiful scenery I have ever witnessed. And again, an impressive sense of scale. After that, we were rolling down the highway all the way to Phoenix. Even with the sun dropping below the horizon, it was still 104 degrees outside. But without that beating down on you, it didn't feel so bad. As we got into the city, we were able to spot several vehicles which probably shouldn't have been on the road, which made me feel a little bit better about our chances with the car I was intending on buying. Which, by the way, this story is finally about to get to. But for now, it had been another long day, and on the way into the city we stopped to buy air mattresses that we quickly dozed off on as soon as we reached Travis's apartment. The next morning, we were up around 8, covered in dog hair and maybe a little bit delirious.
You went rolling the cardboard box?
Travis had to go into work and took his Jetta, but for some reason, entrusted his 1992 F-150 to us.
I need coffee. Please.
He gave us some basic instructions on the quirks of the truck, and we were ready to head off to the gas station to fuel it and us.
Everybody feeling good?
Huh?
I guess so. We haven't even stepped like 50 yards outside the door and we're all already dying. I hate this trip. It's so hot. And it's only gonna get worse.
Unfortunately, one of the truck's quirks was that the air conditioning didn't work.
Alright, I guess I gotta close the door now. Look at that, that's nice.
And the passenger side window was broken and wouldn't roll down.
You did reverse, neutral, no, no, that's drive.
Cool.
Oh, the shifter moved.
Yeah, just like
They went into
just
place.
sitting. Oh, Tesla brake.
That's about. Is it bad? It's not great. That's 40. I don't hear it now. You're getting beat by a Vespa. That's fine. He probably has brakes. Okay, we're in park. Okay, now we gotta turn it off. And I gotta hit the window. Okay. What? Wait, why? Because the electrical system doesn't turn off otherwise. I'm not familiar with that problem.
We definitely found the truck to be full of character, but it was going to be our faithful steed and ferry us to the car that I had picked out. The Ford Pinto I had been looking at was located out in Apache Junction, Arizona, about 40 miles outside of Phoenix. And once we had loaded up on energy drinks, we headed out to see it.
Okay. That's reverse. Is it? Yeah. That's neutral. Those two. No, that's neutral. It's...
Oh.
Don't tell me, Sean.
It looked like 2-man.
It looked like 1.5.
Oh.
That's right.
Yeah.
Nice. How descript is the temperature gauge?
It's on or off.
So it's either on like you're not overheating or you're
already on fire and it's too late.
Travis told us that as long as we kept out of the mountains and didn't get it over 60 miles an hour, the truck wouldn't overheat. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case for us, and we may have been losing it a little bit.
Slight right onto the Arizona 51 South Ramp.
This is
not a slight right. This is just a right.
It's an extremely right, yes.
Very right.
Doesn't get much more right than that. Yeah, it looks like they're setting up for it. That's 55. That feels pretty good.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's pretty smooth. That air is really hot.
Yeah. It feels like a floating trial.
But we were making progress and closing in on the address I was given. The listing for the Pinto went up on June 7th, just 4 days before Rob and I left, so I was quick to get in touch about it. The car seemed to match pretty nicely to the specific set of criteria I had been looking for. 70s or early 80s, a small or mid-size car, 4 seats, ran when parked, solid drivetrain, relatively commonly available parts, a maximum price of $3,000, and what I feared might be the hardest to find, a seller willing to put up with our shenanigans. This was actually the second seller that we had seriously approached with an offer. The first one was a 78 Monza wagon, but after Travis went to see it, the seller demanded more money and then disappeared. So when the Pinto showed up online, I approached the seller carefully. But right away, he was communicative, understanding of what we were trying to do, and even agreed to let us work on the car in his yard. I got his okay and shipped over $1,000 in parts to his house so that they would be there waiting for us. So I was pretty committed to the car, and I really just had to trust in the seller when I was still over 2,000 miles away. The first time we even talked on the phone, I was in the airport terminal waiting to board. So when we finally got to the address, it was a big relief to see that at least the car actually existed. It had already been a wild journey, but we finally made it. Time to meet the car, and Andy, who built the Pinto, is selling it and is going to refrain from calling the cops when we ruin his yard and break his tools in the process of getting it back on the road.
Nope.
And yes, the factory 2.3-liter 4-cylinder engine that came in this 1980 Pinto has been removed, and in its place sits a Ford 302 V8.
So how long was this engine in here?
It's been in here since about 03.
It wasn't driven that much, or just short trips, you said?
Yeah, and it was primarily driven between early 2000s to about 2005. I went on active duty in 05, and I don't remember if I drove it much in 10, and then I moved down here, and it was driven here and there, not a whole lot. And I went ahead and deregistered it when the state figured out that I was down here, and this will not pass the smoke. At the time, I just wasn't driving it much, so I didn't pursue historical vehicle registration. I pulled the fuel out of the tank to try and keep it from varnishing.
Yeah.
Now it still might have some varnish in there, I don't know. I'm trying to run it just from here to the pump and get it to run but not idle, so it must still have something in the carb.
Today when we leave, I'll just take the carburetor back and just re-gasket it, really.
This might be contributing to the heat issues. The radiator may not even be taller than the highest point in the engine water.
Oh, air bubble?
Yeah.
That's the radiator cap that you cut it out for there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Headers look awful to install. You know, they're not bad. Three-piece. Yeah. You drop it in with them loosely fitted. When you get the motor down about level, you got to have the tires off. There's a connecting bar that goes up to the lower control arm. You take that out, and then you just slide these two pieces in from the outside.
Everything is pretty accessible, which is one of the things I liked about this. It's never thrown the belt off?
It has.
Okay, the alignment kind of sucks. We'll shim that out. That's fixable. What is this wire that's just sitting on here loosely? I just disconnected it. Okay, we'll look into that.
Oh good, I can let myself out when everybody forgets I'm back there.
Oh, they're f***ing hot.
Yeah! What's with it's yellow and white and red?
So I painted it red. It's originally white and yellow.
That's very 70s. Somebody needs to sit in the back seat. I knew he was going to say that.
Does that just hit the dash?
It rests on the dash, please.
It's going to require sitting much lower. How long the windows are up front? Like your windows are basically like right where my face is.
So true.
Still going to be airflow.
What's the caution sign covering there?
Where the blower motor came through.
Oh, I see.
You mean you didn't install AC in this?
No. Okay, deal's off.
The speedometer didn't work, and there was no factory tack, so this aftermarket one will be very useful.
You said the shift light does work?
Yeah.
It'll keep you awake.
Oh yeah, that's why that cover's there, to keep it from blinding you.
And the fuel gauge works, the alternator light works, you said?
Yes.
Okay.
There are also mechanical coolant temperature and engine oil pressure gauges right in front of the B&M ratchet shifter that controls the C4 manual valve body transmission that's connected to the engine with a 4,000 RPM stall converter.
The headliner's pretty nice.
Yeah.
It's not droopy at all.
It's a cool material.
Is this re-glued? It's so low.
Don't know.
It's like right in the middle of right in the middle of your vision. I didn't realize the windshield was cracked, but at least it's cracked over there, so that's fine.
Underneath, the car appears very at home in the desert as it's essentially rust-free. The exhaust behind the headers is just a pair of Flowmaster 40s and some short/cut pipes. They're pointed directly at a Ford 9-inch axle with 456 gears and a locker. And of course, we all had to take a look at that infamous Pinto gas tank.
It's all just kind of right there.
Can we just set it to the highest height for all the weight we're gonna have in it? Well, make sure the pinion angle doesn't get too bad.
Those adjustable shackles should definitely help us out. Something that'll be working against us on this road trip though is that when Andy bought the car, it didn't come with any keys. He had replaced the ignition lock cylinder, so there was one ignition key, but still no door keys. If you lock the doors from the inside, the only way to get back into the car is through the hatch because he removed the tumblers from its lock cylinder.
So this will turn with anything.
Okay.
The only downside is somebody's got to crawl through to unlock.
Right.
You're nominated.
Like the shock.
That stick's been in here for years.
Traction bars. Would these fit without modifying them? What
I
are
think
these
they
for?
would need modified. Remember I
holes,
something to do
maybe?
with the shock mount?
Oh, okay. Oh god, the rubber in this.
Yeah, that.
The heat.
Not trust it.
New. Oh, is that the original valve body?
Yes.
So you changed that out and
Yes.
everything? The engine and transmission from an 80 Thunderbird, you said?
Yeah.
Okay. So did you ever race this?
Never been actually on a,
Oh,
on
okay.
a drag strip. By the time I got close enough to a racetrack down here, I wasn't driving it much and I didn't have the money.
What do you think horsepower is? Because factory I looked it up with 130 for a 1980 Thunderbird.
I bet it's right around 260, but because
Okay.
of the weight of the car,
Yeah, that's not bad.
Well, all of us in it.
Yeah,
we're putting on
even then, I mean, it's the same engine as the truck.
Yeah. I think I weighed it with me. I don't remember if the 9-inch was in it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And it weighed like 2380.
How's the stability at high speed?
Not bad. The front end wants to come up just a hair, and then the hood, because it's on just pins,
Yeah.
will float a little bit and rattle. And that's what these old tires, and they were old then. Yes. I repurposed the old positive cable
Right.
in the front.
Yeah.
It's gonna make sure we take them. Yeah.
That's a pretty good size cable.
And then Andy turned on the big Portacool unit.
My God. God, it's so nice.
That thing is powerful.
Yeah.
Instead of road tripping, let's just stand in front of this the next 2 weeks and we'll have it towed home. What's the highest RPM you've gotten it to? What does it seem like it's like?
It is over about 6,100.
Oh, wow.
The cam and the intake are really supporting it. The heads are the restriction.
The Thunderbird 302, other than a 60 over bore and matching pistons, has a stock bottom end. The cylinder heads are also factory, but they had their chambers opened up. Installed in them is a set of roller rocker arms pushed by a fairly large 496 520 valve lift camshaft. The cam is advertised as 3 to 6,000 RPM, which explains the choice of converter. This combination, making a very roughly estimated 260 horsepower, should be 3 times the power of the original Pinto 2.3 liter, which was rated at 88 horses. Parked next to the Pinto is a stripped S10 frame, which would eventually be rolled underneath Andy's 1950 Nash Statesman Airflight that he was kind enough to show us. It'll definitely be a huge amount of work, but I'm very glad somebody is saving one of these cool old cars with a resto mod like that.
I guess like the president of Nashville at one time was traveling somewhere and went to go stay at a motel, and they wanted like 15 cents or dollars to stay at a motel. He said that was too much. So these seats actually fold all the way down.
We'll have to get a bed on wheels like this for the next road trip. But this time, we've got a Pinto to revive. After taking a nice long look at the car and having a long chat with Andy about it, I think we were all feeling pretty excited. In order to get the car started and just drive it down the block, it didn't seem like it would need much. But since our distance goals were a little bit loftier than that, there was a long list of things I really wanted to get done before we hit the road. The car was last registered in 2016, so it had been sitting for at least 5 years and did not get driven much before that. Andy's estimate was that it drove less than 5,000 miles since the 302 was put in the car. So it wasn't much, and it wasn't recent, but at least the car had at one point been put through its paces. We had been warned that driving around at low speeds or getting stuck in traffic would overheat the car, so clearly sorting out the cooling system would be a priority. In the car is an aftermarket 2-core cross-flow Mustang-style radiator with a somewhat anemic Parts Yard special fan pushing through the front of it. There's no thermostat in the engine and no auxiliary transmission cooler. And if we wanted to go down the highway at 75 miles an hour to keep up with traffic, the 456 gears would have the engine screaming at 4,000 RPM. On the one hand, that could keep the transmission cooler because there's less converter slippage, but on the other hand, that's a lot of heat to be putting into the engine. Though if the carburetor isn't sorted out, we probably wouldn't see 75 anyway. We'll also need to make sure that the suspension, steering, and braking systems are intact and reliable. And we wouldn't get very far on those tires, so clearly it'll need new ones. Some of the parts for the car had already arrived, but others, like the rear tires, were stuck in shipping. There were delays on top of delays, and we were kind of at the mercy of the shipping companies because some of these parts weren't ones we would easily find locally. It's hard to fault the carriers for at least some of the delays because there were some serious wildfires burning nearby causing all sorts of disruptions. And from all the smoke, there were air pollution advisories almost every day. We left the car for a bit and drove the F-150 over to the store to get food, water, and a cooler, and when we came back out of the building, there was a serious haze unlike anything I had ever seen. The air was thick, heavy, and had a sickly tint.
I don't know if you can see the haze in the video, but the sky is like brown, green, kinda. There's an air quality alert.
Despite all that, we really had to get back to the car and get to work on it. We made the first visit of many to an auto parts store on the way back, and returned to the Pinto to make what progress we could with the hours of daylight left. Before we left for the trip, I had ordered a bunch of general use tools and shipped them to Travis's apartment. It ended up making more sense to just buy new tools instead of shipping ones I already had, but for budgetary, space, and weight reasons that meant we only had basics. Which is why we were very thankful to Andy for letting us use some of his tools. A full-size floor jack made it way easier to lift the car than the tiny little bottle jack that I had purchased. He could only spare 2 jack stands, so we would have to pick up another pair for the rear of the car next time we were at the store. For today, there's still a lot we can get done with just the front of the car in the air, such as removing the front wheels and taking a good look at everything underneath them.
No. Mouse? Watch out for the Arizona spiders.
Should you want to use your fingers? Oh, spider webs.
I guess. It's just a very thick mat of them. No scary spiders, please. Brake rotors look fine. They look good. Shiny brake rotors like this after the car has been sitting, I've never in my life seen that. They're always solid rust. Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, the brake hoses have seen better days, so we will definitely be replacing them. The outer tie rod boot and upper ball joint boot look good, but the lower joints boot isn't even really attached. Despite that though, we weren't able to find any play in the ball joints, which is good since these are the factory riveted in ones and they are not exactly easy to replace. I don't know what happened to it, but the grease fitting for the lower ball joint was missing, so we'll have to find another one. If we can get fittings on all the joints and flush out the old grease, I think we'll be fine for our road trip. Typical of any old car, but especially one in this kind of environment, most of the rubber parts on there could use replacing. The steering rack boots are starting to fail, and the bushings are just kind of squeezing out like dried Play-Doh. And, well, you've already seen those tires.
For some reason I expected it to bounce.
The driver's side is maybe a little bit better, but around the same as the parts we were just looking at. The steering on the driver's side feels tight, but there's a little bit of play in the passenger side inner tie rod. Overall though, it seems pretty solid and should be good enough. The same goes for the front shocks, which seem to have lived a few lifetimes already. Those, along with the front springs, are from a Mustang II to help better support the weight of the engine swap. This is also the best look yet at the underside of the car, and as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty much immaculate. Though, of course, some modifications have been made.
Inner wheel wells, yeah, they're cut out.
Most notably, these two big openings to fit those crazy headers. Of course, the engine also required custom mounts, and here you can see how that was accomplished. This is also when I realized that the rubber engine mounts had been welded solid. Had I thought to ask about these in advance, I definitely would have ordered replacement mounts, but now there wasn't really time, so we'll have to live with them. Just like how the car doesn't have any sway bars. To make way for the engine, the front one was totally removed, and it never had one in the back. Up top, we're going to go ahead and remove the Holley 1850 600 CFM carburetor so that we can make sure it's in good working order. This isn't what was on there when Andy was actually driving it around. That was a mechanical secondary 850 CFM. The block's 60 over bore makes it around 311 cubic inches, and with the relatively modest horsepower output, a 600 CFM carb is definitely big enough for street use, certainly for our use during this trip. Though I'm a bit less sure about that single plane intake manifold. Traditionally, those offer good support for high RPM speeds, but can have some questionable manners at lower speeds. But we won't be changing it, so fingers crossed it behaves for us. Since the car's been sitting for a while, of course it's a good idea to change the oil. When Sean checked the dipstick, it was actually pretty light in color, but everything must have settled down to the bottom of the pan because what was coming out of there was pretty dark. So, pretty safe to say that draining that out was a worthwhile endeavor. Sean went ahead and spun the old filter off of there to make room for the new one, which was just the easiest one for us to get locally since the ones I had ordered online hadn't shown up yet. Andy said the motor always had great oil pressure, but I still wanted to go with something a little bit heavier because of the high ambient temperature.
I remember you're gonna turn it sideways, so that's good, that's plenty.
He also said he wasn't running zinc, which to me is concerning in a flat tappet engine, but there weren't any sparkly bits in the drained oil, so it's probably fine. Just to be on the safe side though, we will be adding half a bottle of zinc additive.
Pours like water.
Pretty thin.
Yeah. It sure says 1040.
Pretty thin for 1040.
It's very hot, I don't know.
Is it weird that's making me have to pee?
Yes. It's at 1030. I definitely thought I got 1040. The big one is 1030. It's 1035.
The oil change was pretty much all the work we got done on the car. The rest of the day was spent organizing parts, looking everything over, and making a plan.
You want to see this beautiful list that I made?
Sean, add shim alternator onto the list.
But it's full. We can't fit it anymore.
It just made sense to do as much as we could to ensure that the rest of the trip would proceed smoothly. And of course, we would much rather work standing in front of the big cooler than melting in a parking lot somewhere. It makes it way nicer to work on some of the fiddly, time-consuming stuff like wiring, and that's very important since half of what's in the engine bay looks like these jumper cables.
I'll pick up the big pieces.
Was it worth the joke?
Yeah. Well, are we kicked out now? Okay, then it was worth the joke. I think that's the most brutal installation I've ever seen.
An oft-repeated piece of car person wisdom says that you shouldn't buy another person's project car because you're just buying their problems. And sure, there might be more surprises than a totally original car, but I feel that a car like this that's already had so much time, attention, and care poured into it is important to save too.
How you feeling about your purchase?
I like the car.
So I'm thankful for having the opportunity to acquire it. For today though, the car will remain where it sits. We'll be back in the morning to tackle more of Sean's list, but for now we hopped in the F-150 and headed back to Travis's for the night. The work wasn't quite done though, because I still wanted to go through the carburetor and get that out of the way. So just after midnight, I sat out on the balcony with the carburetor and took a good look at it. Fortunately, other than some old gaskets, everything was in order. Unfortunately for me, it was still 100 degrees outside as I was doing this. We'll take note of the primary jets, which are a 64 and an upside down 2 to indicate it's a close limit jet. Typically, those are only used for precise emissions tuning, so they're probably original to it. There was a bit of dirt and old gasket material in there, so I went through and gave everything a thorough spray down. Which, when you're holding the parts over the side of a balcony, is a very strange feeling. But luckily, I managed not to drop anything, so no unsuspecting passersby on a midnight stroll got a holly to the noggin. This whole run-through was done with nothing but a multi-tool, and I couldn't quite get the needles and seats out, so they'll stay until they prove to be a problem, and then we can always change those later. To replace the old gaskets, I had a set of new ones, but unfortunately the one underneath the metering plate was different. The old one was intact, and I didn't really have a choice, so we'll go ahead and reuse it. I also had a full rebuild kit that didn't have a matching gasket or any kind of balance tube seal, so unfortunately we'll keep the old ones there too. At this point it was 2 AM, which felt like 5 AM on the East Coast, so it was definitely time to call it for the night. The next morning, we dragged ourselves out of bed, hopped back in the truck, and went to the store for some supplies. Perhaps most importantly, drinks and ice. As the week went on, the forecasted temperatures were higher and higher, so this frozen water became more and more important.
Stop wasting the ice. Ready for the day? Hi, Mom.
Kill me, please.
From there, we headed back to the Pinto.
Day 2, we're back for more. Should probably do more than just changing the oil this time, though.
It took us so long to leave the apartment and find everything we were looking for at the store, the sun was already well overhead and blazing down at us through the smoky haze.
We got this thermometer to try to see how hot it got today. We've been here, 10 minutes, and it's already broken. The glass actually shattered. So, it's pretty hot. We have more jack stands because there were only 2. We probably want 4. They have an actual battery. And just in case Pinto happens, we can try to save our lives.
Not even the local fauna was having a good time in this heat. I don't recall seeing a single living spider or insect the entire time we were in the state. Regardless of the weather, we have a lot of work to get done, so we'll lay out our equipment and get to it. Now that we have 4 jack stands, we can get the whole vehicle off of the ground. But because of the gravel underneath, this was a bit tricky.
It's not touching this one.
Luckily, Andy had some pieces sitting around, and we ended up with 2x4s under the back right and a 1/2-inch board under the back left. Eventually, we had everything solid and the car didn't seem like it was going to go anywhere.
It's good.
With the car fully in the air, the hanging positive battery cable is directly in our faces. Sean is going to cover this with split loom and secure it as well as possible, but long term it probably shouldn't stay here. First though, we'll have to remove the rear wheels.
These aren't very tight.
Oh, they're not?
No. These were the lug nuts holding it on. He cut the caps off?
Yeah, the cap, because it wouldn't go all the way
Cut
in.
the acorn cap off. Similarly gross.
545 horsepower.
That's how much we're making, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we should be good then.
Yeah.
The brake drums are looking pretty furry, but we probably won't be messing with much in them since it's all basically new. I did want a full set of lug nuts for the rear though, and picked some up at the store.
I just want to make sure these don't bottom out like his old ones did. Yeah, these are good, the new ones.
Waiting for parts in the mail and trying to find them locally was a constant struggle for us trying to get this car back on the road.
Come on, FedEx. Where's FedEx? I'm gonna see if there's anyone around here who has a rear brake hose. It's intact, but kind of dry rotty.
So we did a lot of scrounging around and kept making compromises on what exactly good enough looked like.
Cinch it down, box it up.
Yeah. That's fine.
We would definitely need headlights though, so Sean worked on replacing the old ones and some of the other indicator bulbs. Other than a few obviously burnt out ones, we weren't actually sure which bulbs were bad and which weren't. I kinda just wanted to replace them all so we had a fresh slate to start with. I'm not sure the car appreciated this though, and it kept fighting back.
I'm already bleeding from the car, and I accidentally rubbed it into the fender, but you can't even see it. It's the perfect color.
We already got blood and sweat on it now. Mike, start crying.
Oh, we'll get there.
We were down one thermometer, but I had left this food one on the roof just to see how high it would get even if it was directly in the path of the cooler.
125.
Probably best to not keep looking at that and get to work on some of the scarier looking electronics in the engine bay.
I'm going to tidy up this alternator mounting a bit first. This piece that was made to fill here isn't very flat, and it's actually kind of chipping the alternator and pushing it inward, so we're just going to replace that with some nuts and washers for now. Then we're going to want to tidy up some of these nasty wires. Well, the boots are cracked, we can't really do anything about that, but I'm going to at least put tubing on these. You can see there's some exposed copper areas there.
We'll be putting a new ignition coil in the car, as well as replacing all of the spark plug wires, a few of which were burnt, as well as the distributor cap and rotor once the new parts actually show up.
Oh, that's not held on at all, okay.
I wasn't a big fan of the intricate steel fuel line that was doing its best to contact the pulleys, but for the time being it's going to have to stay put. We'll loosen up the alternator and get the belt off of there to figure out what size it is so that we can have a spare ready. And we'll remove the wires from it because, well...
The alternator wire is not looking the best. I don't have any more of this size. Gonna do a lot of taping and then split loom it. It's not bad all the way down, it was just this like 2 feet of wire. So we'll tape that up and pretend we never saw it.
Not all of the wires in the engine bay were looking quite as bad as that one, but there was definitely a lot of corrosion.
That's the voltage regulator, definitely. It's pretty gross. Just gonna clean it off. Should work. It's just dirty.
We'll also go through and do what we have to do to remove the spark plugs.
That one wasn't real tight, okay.
And once they're all out, we'll take a look at the old ones to see if there are any major red flags about the engine's condition, but other than being a bit rich and having some miles on them, there doesn't appear to be anything particularly wrong with them. Still, we have a new set of plugs that will be installed in their place. Before we could pull all the old plugs though, we had a welcome interruption.
FedEx. FedEx here.
FedEx man, my best friend. One of the big things we were waiting on that finally showed up were the new rear tires. We wanted to get all that sorted out right away, so we threw all the wheels and tires in the back of the F-150 and Sean headed to a local tire shop to get them changed out. Well, as soon as he was able to find drive.
The shifter in that thing is questionable.
Yeah, that's neutral. There you go.
While he was off taking care of that, Rob and I went around anti-seizing all of the new spark plugs and getting them installed. Once those were all ready to go, Rob went around wrapping wires in the engine bay, trying to make everything at least a little bit less terrifying. And it was time for me to break out the new set of spark plug wires. Well, actually, it was 2 sets of wires. The top one I had ordered in advance and was for a 1980 305 Thunderbird. But after seeing the car, it became obvious that those wouldn't fit for every cylinder because of the headers. So locally, we picked up the lower set, which was for a 1985 C10 pickup. I chose this set since I knew they would have straight as well as 90-degree boots, and that would give us good options. We installed the new cap and rotor and took some time to fit all of the new wires. Going through both sets to find the best fit and wire length took a while, but we ended up using mostly the 305 wires. Only cylinders number 4 and 7 got 90-degree boots on the spark plug end. And once they're all in there, they'll get some basic zip tie wire separators to keep them off of the headers and away from each other. Meanwhile, Rob was underneath the car working on removing the alternator bracket.
Hey Rob, how you doing down there?
Oh Jesus!
Rob's down there loosening up this bracket.
entire alternator bracket, really.
Did you move that?
No, it just kind of shifted there. It's fine. The top bolt is probably threaded in.
Okay, good.
He's loosening that up down there because we need to move this whole thing forward. You can see it a little bit in the video. This pulley is too far back, so it's gonna probably throw belts on the highway. So we need to shim the whole thing forward, maybe like a 1/4 inch. It's a fair amount. We already switched slanted steel spacer out for nuts, but we're gonna need more. Stick some extra washers behind the bracket and move the whole thing forward. This bracket is supposed to hold a couple things, but we only have an alternator, so.
Oh, shit.
Is it leaking?
Yeah.
The studs holding on that bracket also hold on the water pump and go through into coolant passages. As it turned out, the bracket spacing was only wrong because the hexes of the studs were supposed to be behind it, and once it was back together in that orientation, everything was lining up much better. But we'll have to finish sorting that out later since we don't have the right hardware on hand. Evening was already closing in on us, and that to-do list was still looking pretty long. There was no way we were getting through it all today, but at least we were able to cross a big one off the list when Sean came back with the new tires mounted and balanced. As with many of these parts, I had ordered the tires before even seeing the car, so I just went with the sizes that were already on there. That's neutral, yeah. The fronts are 175/70 13s, and the rears are 295/50 15s. There's a pretty big size difference between them. Along with not hitting the road on dry rotted tires, one of the biggest changes we were making to the car was the rear gearing. This was free shipping, so I wonder how much it costs, but it was like 1-day shipping. Ship weight was 79 pounds.
Beautiful. Shiny, dude.
Yeah, this is new. To hopefully improve the car's highway manners, we have a complete center section with higher ratio gears ready to go in. Yeah, this is a clutch limited slip. This gear set is a much higher 3.25-to-1 to replace the old 456. In order to make the change, of course, we have to remove the current center section. Sean is getting started on this by removing all of the old gear oil via the plug at the bottom of the axle. Turns out, even that 75/90 oil flows pretty freely when it's 115 degrees. With that empty, the drum can come off, and you can get to the 4 bolts that hold on the bearing plate that retains the axle shaft. Once all 4 have been loosened and the nuts are fully unthreaded, the axle shaft, bearing plate, and in this case, the backing plate will all pull off of the axle tube. Then the axle shaft can be slid out far enough to disengage fully from the differential so that it won't get in the way. Then Sean will go ahead and repeat that same process on the other side. The fasteners are once again loosened, and the axle shaft can be pulled out of the differential. Now the U-bolts holding the drive shaft to the differential bolt can be removed.
Oh, those were loose. Yeah, those were like finger tight.
We were definitely starting to notice a trend of loose hardware on the car, so we'll have to keep that in mind and check the torque on as many things as we can. With the U-bolts removed, the drive shaft can be slid forward and, being very careful not to drop the U-joint caps,
No.
luckily only a few rollers fell out of the cap when it hit the gravel and we were able to find them all. Of course, we'll have to go through and clean all that up before reassembly though. For now, Sean is going to loosen the 10 nuts around the perimeter of the center section which hold it to the axle housing. He was able to use Andy's impact gun for most of these, but a few are a little on the close side and need a good old-fashioned combination wrench.
I can't move my neck anymore. Also, I may have spun one of the studs at the top. Yeah, I'm not really sure what to do about that.
Is there the gap between it and the housing?
No.
So, like, pry it and turn it? It took a few minutes of messing around, but eventually we managed to get a combination wrench underneath the nut and pry between it and the housing to help hold the stud in place while the nut is spun off.
Yeah.
That felt bad.
Good job.
Fortunately, that worked, and now the center section was free to come off.
Can I just drop it?
Please don't.
I got covered in juice.
Turns out it wouldn't be quite that easy because the whole thing was thoroughly glued on with RTV. There was a lot of hammering and prying and hammering and crying that happened, and eventually hammering the pry bar against this little recess in the third member made it move just the tiniest bit. Then we took this flathead screwdriver we found in Travis's F-150, sorry, Travis, and hammered on it in that area until things finally started to separate. Once that got started, it didn't take a whole lot more prying to get the entire thing loose. Then we had our human sacrifice assume the position underneath the axle.
I'm gonna need a new shirt.
Strong boy, strong boy.
So let me try to pry the top here.
Oh.
Oh God.
There it is.
Oh, that's so much heavier than I expected. Oh, that's really heavy. Oh God.
You got it. Nice work. You're so strong.
Oh, my shirt.
Another casualty of war.
Okay, look, $3.
But it's getting late in the day, so there's no time to mourn Sean's wardrobe.
Got a little dirt there when you dragged it out, but oh well.
We managed to get it pretty dirty, so hopefully the new one fits.
So the yoke is the thing I wasn't sure about. Let's make sure that's the same.
The default option for this aftermarket setup was a 1310 yoke, so I just went with that since Andy wasn't sure what the old one on the car was. Luckily, this worked out because they both have the same yoke, which means we don't have to switch one over or dig into the center sections at all.
Peach.
For Hong Kong.
Whoa!
There were quite a few casting differences between the two, including the flange on the aftermarket one being much thicker, but it seemed like everything would still be okay to interchange. Before we can put the new one in, though, we have to figure out what was going on with that spinning stud. It appeared to have fallen into the axle housing, so we'll fish that out.
Oh, it's not. It's just a hex bolt. What the hell? Oh, it was welded. Oh no.
That's why.
As it turned out, it wasn't a stud at all, it was just a hex bolt that had been tack welded inside the housing. And that tiny weld did not hold up to the stress of being loosened with the impact gun. The rest of the fasteners in the housing are pressed in studs, just like you'd see for holding on a wheel, but for this one it looks like the original studs spun the splines off. I decided we should wait until tomorrow to install the new center section because I wanted to see if I could find a slightly oversized lug stud to install instead. For now, something we can do is adjust the leaf springs to get the maximum amount of lift out of those shackles.
How violent is it gonna like pop down?
The shock should hold it in. Right?
Yes.
Oh, that was like barely on there.
The shocks are limiting the down travel of the springs, though I didn't quite imagine how much. The eyelets popped pretty much all the way back up to the factory shackle location.
Whoa.
I hear thunder.
Is it on jack? Put it on jack.
It's on.
The springs are soft enough that there was still some travel to the axles, so as long as we can get the shocks back on, we should probably be okay to unbolt them and lower the leaf springs to the bottom holes on the shackles. The rear bolt on the passenger side was either a DIY lock nut or just plain cross-threaded because it really didn't want to come off.
Did you get it?
Yeah, it was really on there.
Either way, eventually it came loose and Sean was able to knock out the bolt. Then we could lower the floor jack enough to get the bolts through in the bottommost shackle positions. While we were doing this, Rob kept telling us he was hearing thunder, and I kept telling him that it was just the firefighting helicopters flying overhead. I was wrong.
Yeah, I hear thunder too.
Uh-oh.
The closer it got, the more you could feel the storm coming in. So we had to hurry and finish up with the leaf springs. We got both of the rear bolts through and just about snugged down since we need to tighten them at ride height, and Rob and Sean used the floor jack to get the rear shocks reattached while I was running around trying to clean everything up. The shocks would still limit the maximum suspension travel, but we figured with the weight in the car we probably wouldn't be hitting that anyway. Everything was as far together as it was going to get, and we really just needed to pack up and get out of there.
You're gonna find out how waterproof the Pinto is. Oh no.
It died.
Everything's falling apart. That's it for now.
The thunder was getting closer and closer, louder and louder. And lightning was very much making an appearance. It only took us about 20 minutes to get everything put away, but in that time it went from a bright sky to almost pitch black. It was just starting to rain as we all hopped in the truck and left for the night. Later, we found out that it didn't rain that much at all, and other than the high winds, we pretty much outran the storm heading back to Phoenix. The storm helped briefly to cool things off, but it still stayed pretty hot. It was 9 p.m., dark out, and still 105 degrees. There was no escaping the heat, but at least we avoided getting struck by lightning. We also found out a fun trick in the F-150. Not only can you pull out the key while the truck is running, but you actually need a key or something in there to shut the truck back off.
Turn off the car!
Trying.
Oh wait, you need this. Oh yeah.
After finally managing to shut the truck off, we turned in for the night. As was becoming the norm, once again we dragged ourselves out of bed and hopped in the F-150 to hit the road to Apache Junction. We were also in a roll of just eating gas station food because there wasn't really time for anything else. This morning I even bought pre-packaged freezer taquitos despite the availability of fresh Mexican food. Andy had to go into work Thursday at around noon, and I promised him that we would have the car out of his yard before then. So this was the last full day we have to work on the car. A bunch of things supposedly are showing up today that got more or less lost or at least delayed in the mail system. Some of these were pretty core to my plans, like the radiator fan and shroud, so we were really hoping they would actually get delivered this time. But until then, we had to keep working with the parts that we did have on hand. Rob got to work right away, scraping all the old RTV off of the axle housing. Despite my searching, I hadn't been able to find a slightly oversized repair stud or a set of factory-sized studs locally. And for a bunch of reasons, welding the bolt back in wasn't a viable option. Structurally, it didn't seem like leaving out one stud out of the 10 would be the end of the world, but we would have to be careful with the one right next to it.
2 of these are welded, by the way.
Really?
Did you see that?
Nah.
The stud at the very tippy top of this is also welded.
The topmost one is welded in a bit better, but we would still definitely have to be careful when installing and tightening down the center section. Once Rob had finished scraping the surface, Sean rolled under there and wiped down everything with brake clean. He worked on getting the ceiling surface ready and wiped out the housing for good measure.
Rob! Rob! I forgot to pull the axles back out.
Instead of RTV, we're going to be using this special gasket, mostly because I never want to have to pry the center section out of there again. And with that on there, it was once again time for Sean to bench press a big hunk of iron and steel. With the car this low to the ground, it is much harder than it looks to lift up that 80 pounds, but Sean did a fantastic job and got everything in place quickly. And once it was fully mated to the axle, he would start locking that down. While Sean was doing the heavy lifting, I was working on cleaning up the drive shaft U-joint caps. Since we were able to find all of the rollers and everything appeared to be in good shape, all they needed was a cleaning and repacking with grease before being reinstalled. And with both of those back in place, we would have to be careful not to knock them loose again. Sean went around in a crisscross pattern and tightened down the 9 nuts that would hold the housing in place. These are supposed to have copper sealing washers underneath them to prevent oil leakage, but we didn't have any, so hopefully it doesn't leak too bad. A bigger concern than that is the missing stud that left a big hole in the top of the housing, which wasn't good for oil coming out or dirt getting in. We had to make do with what we had, so we decided to just RTV in that bolt that had fallen out. This will act as a plug to seal everything up. We'll just have to see how that holds up over time. Next up, the drive shaft can be slotted into the differential yoke. Then the U-bolts and nuts can be reinstalled and tightened down. Hopefully they'll stay a little bit tighter than they did last time.
I'm not tight, these are supposed to be.
Pretty soon, all that was left to do was slot back in the axle shafts and bolt down the bearing retainers. Once those are nice and tight, the axle will get filled with 75 W90 limited slip gear oil. In total, it took about 2.5 quarts. And with that, it's done. The axle is totally back together. Hopefully, these 325 gears will keep the engine happier on the highway. But even though that was one big job completed, there was still a lot left to do. Rob was continuing work on making the engine bay wiring less of a fire hazard, and I was doing a lot of running around to auto parts and similar stores trying to get everything we needed. This was small stuff like Loctite and bigger stuff like brake hoses, since the ones I had ordered online seemed like they might not show up in time. I also managed to find a pair of shock extenders. Well, it was supposed to be a pair, but when I got back to the car, I realized there was only one in the package. This ended up as a bit of a debacle, and I had to call them on the phone 4 times and go back to the store 2 times before I had a pair of the right extenders. Only they weren't, because these are fine thread and the shocks are coarse, which meant they wouldn't fit anyway. So we would just have to stick with these short rear shocks and see how it goes. As for working on things that could actually be helpful, Sean was working on draining and removing the radiator from the car. With the upper and lower hoses out of the way, this was as simple as removing the 4 bolts that held the radiator to the steel straps bridging the remains of the core support. The coolant itself looked pretty much fine, but looking inside the thermostat housing, it was clear that there would definitely be some rust and debris in the system. The inside of the lower hose was totally coated in a silty sort of powder. This was probably a combination of aluminum oxidation, iron powder, and who knows what else. But the good news were that the last 2 deliveries finally showed up. So we had a fan shroud and a massive 16-inch diameter fan, which would direct airflow over the radiator much better than the old open fan, but would also be mounted behind the radiator as a puller instead of an inefficient pusher out front. Hopefully this combination would resolve the car's propensity to overheat, but we could still end up on the side of the road if one of the many damaged wires in the engine bay shorted out and caused trouble. Rob continued to work on this, wrapping any wires with damaged insulation and grouping them together with split loom to protect them a little bit from heat and abrasion.
Watch out for that snake, Rob!
Oh, Jesus Christ.
All of the engine bay electronics were coming together, and we were moving towards the point of firing up the car again. Though it was still trying to fight back, and when Rob lightly brushed his arm against the voltage regulator cover, it popped right off. Whatever glue had been holding it in place had failed, and just to retain some kind of weather resistance, we RTV'd it back on. Even with unexpected setbacks like that coming up now and then, we were still making progress on the list. A really big one was getting the car insured and registered. Luckily for us, Arizona offers a 90-day out-of-state temporary registration that I was able to get very easily. So at least we'll be legally driving down the road in our shaky, noisy death box. There was only so much we could do for comfort, but at least we could improve the safety of the car by removing the ancient dry-rotted brake hoses. Once again saving the day, Andy lent us a flare nut wrench since the cheap combination wrenches I had purchased were doing their best to round everything off. None of these appeared to be leaking, and even though you can see it when you shouldn't be able to, the inner liner of the hose does appear to be intact. But brake hoses are typically inexpensive to replace and are a very important part for vehicle safety. And since we're starting with a project car Pinto, we're going to need all the help we can get in that department. Once the new front hose was in place, Sean worked on removing the rear one from the car. The old rear hose also had some cracking, but was actually in much better shape than the fronts. Still, it's nice to have a replacement.
Shake off the rocks and then go for it.
Fortunately, all of the new brake hoses fit, and we actually had a spare set since I had purchased some locally and then the online ones showed up too. So we're really covered on those. Meanwhile, I was back to trying to sort out the alternator mounting. I worked out that we could switch around 2 of the water pump studs and use hardware that I picked up at the store to mount the stamped steel bracket on top of them. And after a bit more fiddling, the alternator pulley is lined up very well with the crank pulley. Then the water pump pulley can be shimmed with a few washers and bolted back down. For whatever reason, there's not really a register on the water pump that lines up with the pulleys, so it's just relying on the bolts to center it. Similarly, the crankshaft pulley is just sitting on washers and not really centered with anything either. So, despite now having a good alignment for all 3 pulleys, it's not impossible that we could have belt issues due to the single alternator mounting bolt or wobble in the pulleys. It's just something we'll have to keep an eye on. For now, the radiator demands attention and we have to unhook the transcooler lines to fully remove it from the car.
Oh, that was easy.
Those came loose without a fight, but it was a little concerning that there didn't appear to be any fluid in the lines at all.
Oh, good. Nothing. Well, 3 drips.
We were going to be adding an auxiliary transmission cooler in line after the radiator, so we had to identify which line was which based on where it was going into the transmission.
This right now is hooked to the return. It's 1/8 inch NPT in the radiator. Going to these are hydraulic hoses that he had custom made for the transmission cooler, which is really overkill, but kind of cool.
While we worked on the car, the sun was working on melting the ice in our cooler.
How cold is it in there? Is there any ice left?
Little bitty chunks floating around.
Not much else. Well, except for your taquitos.
Oh yeah, we gotta cook those.
A test fit made it clear that to mount the fan behind it, the radiator would have to come forward a bit. This would be doable, but it would also run into the hood. Andy already had to make room for the radiator cap previously, but since we were moving it, we were going to need even more. The hood is already on pins in the front, and the latching mechanism is obviously gone, so the remains of the latch receptacle on the hood will not be missed.
So yeah, can we borrow?
We guessed at how much material would have to come out, and Sean used the borrowed angle grinder to cut out the last remaining part of the hood latch assembly. Some cardboard over the engine would protect it at least a little bit from the sparks, and pretty soon that chunk of steel could be broken loose. Then, the last remaining steel bits and some panel bond can be scraped off to tidy things up. We certainly ended up with a lot more space to work with, but to make sure it's enough, we'll have to assemble the radiator and install it in the car. The first thing we need to do to get that ready is install our auxiliary transmission cooler to the front of the radiator. The cooler is a Hayden 679, which I chose because it was about the biggest I could find, and we'll just be mounting it with plastic push-through ties.
Where'd it go? What? Jesus, John.
Well, I didn't do anything like that.
You shifted it. You shifted it.
Once that's in place, we can test fit the fan shroud on the other side. The fan and shroud came as a set, and I chose it because most were set up for 14-inch fans, and I figured we would want as much cooling as we could possibly get. This large 16-inch fan does fit nicely over the shroud, though we will have to drill the holes to mount it. I wanted to run into the self-tapping screws to make sure everything lines up correctly, but the half-inch impact we'd been using for a while suddenly died. And it wasn't just the battery, this was the last little spin it would ever make. For some reason, Andy still let us use his tools and lent us a drill and driver. We used the power tools that I didn't break to finish mounting the fan to the shroud and the shroud to the radiator. This was done with the hardware that came with those parts, including nylock nuts for the fan bolts and 8 self-tapping screws to hold the shroud to the radiator itself. With all of those in place and tightened down, we were ready to do another test fit. We were hoping to use the existing holes in the steel straps and some spacers to mount the radiator, and this mostly worked, we just had to drill the holes out a little bit larger to help everything align. The spacers we're using are actually something I brought from home that I made in a hurry right before we left. And by that I mean these were finished 2 minutes before getting in the car to go to the airport. We got this piece of 1-inch diameter, 60-61, and we'll be making them 2 1/8 inches long, and we're going to need 4. I could come up with some excuses, but the entire reason I made these spacers before leaving was because I had just bought this mini lathe and I wanted to play with it. I definitely didn't get impatient and just use the Sawzall. Now we're just going to do a quick facing pass on each of these, get them to the same length. I was mostly just concerned about speed, so all the controls had to be operated in an efficient manner. The length was a total guess, but worked out perfectly. The fan really couldn't sit any closer to the water pump pulley. But how about the hood? Well, not quite.
It's this side where the cap
Just notch it a little more.
Yeah.
We were going to be able to make that fit, but what about the grill? This didn't fit before because of the pusher fan, but now we had a chance.
It's actually not the worst.
We'll just zip tie it directly to the radiator
Yeah.
and leave it like that.
It's getting zip tied to something.
It looks much better with that installed, though it doesn't quite fit the way it used to. But with a little bit of trimming later on, hopefully we can make that fit. The hood, however, is a little bit more pressing, so we'll take care of that right away. Sean took a few more minutes working his magic with the angle grinder to remove about another inch on the driver's side that will hopefully make all the difference.
Hey,
Oh yeah.
you did it.
Be careful, please, with your fingers.
Why? It's not sharp. You did it.
It's an eighth of an inch. Yeah. But yeah, we couldn't have moved it up. That is as high as that thing goes. Okay,
Pop through the R.
And with the mounting figured out, which was the biggest hurdle, we all split up again to take on different jobs. Rob worked on organizing and mounting some things on the interior of the car, most notably the hanging fuse box and the shroud for the shifter. Sean went around and cleaned all the glass on the car so that you could actually start to see through some of it. Meanwhile, I borrowed a gas can from Andy and went to go fill it, as well as run to the parts store one more time. While I was gone, Sean and Rob also went around and bled the brakes at all four corners, flushing out all of the old fluid. By the time they finished, the pedal feel was perfect and immensely better than it was before. At this point, it was already well into the evening, and we all started to scramble to get the car to run before we called it a night. We had spent all this time on various aspects of the car, but we hadn't even hooked up the battery and turned it over yet. Like so many other things on this trip, we had to have a bit of blind faith, and Andy was telling us that the engine was good, so until we heard it run, we didn't really have a choice but to believe that it was good. Some of the new last-minute things we had to take care of were cutting to length and installing the new upper and lower radiator hoses, bolting on the carburetor that I had half-assed rebuilt on Monday night, pouring in about as much concentrated coolant and distilled water as it would take, filling the transmission, which didn't seem like it had much oil in it at all, adding 2.5 gallons to the gas tank, which seemed like it didn't have anything in it, and wiring in the radiator fan. The previous fan was wired through a relay to the ignition, so I just hooked it up to the existing wires. We would have to check on the polarity though before I wired everything in for good. And to do that, the battery would finally have to be hooked up. And remember, this requires some care because of the battery cable colors.
That could have been bad.
Yeah, right now the red is ground.
And I almost killed the car.
Jesus, Rob. Rob, this is your fault. Everybody ready?
Sure. Spark.
Fans on.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's going pretty good.
But how about the lights?
They're 20% brighter, Sean. Look at right there. Is the other corner light on? It goes. Yeah, maybe the blinker's bad. Maybe you're right. There's no light. The door buzzer works. Where's the hazard? Oh.
Other than the turn signals, most of the lights were working, and after securing the radiator fan wire, we were about ready to try to start it.
Press the pedal slow. Okay, that's wide open. That's good. Hit it.
Despite how it may sound, that sputtering and coughing is actually a very good sign. That tells us that we have spark and the ignition system is at least mostly working. Since the gas hardlines, hose, filter, and the carburetor are all totally empty, it will take some time to fill it up with the mechanical fuel pump. Sean gave the engine some gas, and I told him to vary it between 2 and 3,000 RPM for about 60 seconds to make sure we get enough oil splashed up on the camshaft that it's thoroughly lubricated. The camshaft has enough miles on it that it should be broken in, but since the engine hasn't really been run in quite a while, it's a good idea to make sure we have oil everywhere important. Once he released the gas and let it idle, it got pretty choppy.
That's about where this motor bike is. That's not bad for the fresh right out of the box.
The camshaft is fairly sizable, so it's not surprising it would have a bit of a lumpy idle. And when revved, it came to life and was sounding really good. It was acting a bit weird to adjustments though, and as soon as we took a look down the top, it was clear that the main boosters were leaking. Remember when I rebuilt the carburetor with just a multi-tool and I was too lazy to get a wrench to remove the needles and seats? Yeah. But luckily, on a Holly, those are very easy to change, and it doesn't even require removing the bowls.
I think the needle is stuck open now. I do have new ones. I just didn't have a chance to replace them, so I'll do that. It sounds good. I mean, it's running rich as all hell. I'm sure it'll sound a little better, but...
You usually look just like that.
Mm-hmm. We'll top off the transmission again, because that needs to be tested too. After having all that fuel drip down into the intake though, it didn't really want to idle again, so we just quickly verified that reverse and first gear work, which they did, and we decided to shut the engine off for the night. Something I'm sure the neighbors appreciated because the car is very loud. But it's just something we would have to learn to live with. There wasn't much else to do in the dark, and we agreed to call it a night, so we started to clean up. Just so I didn't forget to do it later, I had bought a can of black spray paint and went around painting any exposed metal I saw. That way, at least I could feel like I tried to do something to prevent rust before we got back to a humid area. After that, we finished packing everything up and said goodbye to Andy for the night. This was the longest day spent working on the car so far, and we were really feeling it since we were trying to rush pretty much the whole time. I'm not sure I can conclusively say it was the most productive day of the 3, but it probably was. And all the running around and scrambling over the last 3 days was starting to take its toll. One of the victims, which paid most dearly for it, were my taquitos. Yeah, I had completely forgotten about them until we got back to Travis's and Sean went to go drain the cooler out in the parking lot. The ice inside remained as but a memory, and as the lid was raised, a foul odor set upon us. Drifting atop the putrid sea was the cardboard coffin which once housed cheap, frozen delights. As if expecting an answer from the fervid night air, I supposed aloud, "Those have to be sealed in plastic, don't they?" The rejoinder came from a slimy, grotesque mass that slid from the box clasped in Sean's hands and scattered on the curb. No, they do not. My engrossment had let the tortilla tapestries become awash in lukewarm stew, and the blood-red automobile had been extended another sacrifice. Wait, what was that? Was that the end? Oh, you've got to be kidding me. It took months to put this video up. I am not making a second part. Oh, f right off.
Your mind and mine are strangely intertwined, and that's just a-okay with me. You're perfect in the perfect way. You're perfect and I hope you stay. Your goofy little self eternally. Oh, I'm weird like you, I know it's true. I'm in the clouds friends up there with you. You think you're flawed, but wouldn't you agree? You're perfect for me.